We don't have to worry about it. We don't have to doubt, right? The things of the Lord are sure. Okay. Tell you what, we're just going to sing the 2 songs today, and then we're just going to jump right in. We are going to be in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Now, for those that are visiting, I'll lay out a little context here of what we've been doing. We've been doing this for a long time. We've been going through the New Testament, and we have been talking about how the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, okay? And there is a multitude of places where that is done. And honestly, we're even just mostly focused on the places where it does a direct quote. I'm not even talking about all of the times where it just refers to the Old Testament. We're trying to focus on the places it quotes the Old Testament. And the other thing to set the stage here is I don't want to just jump into a book and a chapter and a verse and say, hey, here it quotes Leviticus. Right? And so what we've been doing is we've been going through the entire book. So we did like 1 Peter, we've done Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, we've done Acts, we've done Romans, and we've really just kind of walked through those books and say, how does this book use the Old Testament? We are up to the book of 1 Corinthians, and listen, there has been a lot of stuff going on in the book of 1 Corinthians, right? And as Paul has kicked us off here, he has talked about the fact that they've got some challenges. Some of their challenges are that they're dividing off into these little cliques, and they're saying, well, hey, I'm of Paul. No. Apollos, man, he's the guy, right? And Paul has basically had to come back along to them and say, you guys are still carnally minded. Like, I'm wanting to talk to you about some deep spiritual things, and you guys are still arguing and debating over which guy you're following, and you've lost sight of the fact that, man, we're supposed to be centered on Christ. He goes so far as basically say, look, I'm just the messenger. It's not about me. It's about Christ. He's talked to them about the fact that even though they have those divisions and those cliques and those things they're struggling with, they seem to be ignoring the giant elephant in the room, and they've got this guy who's having an affair with his father's wife, and this is this wicked, horrible sin, and yet you guys are in one, not only not doing something about it, the indication is almost that they seemed like, I don't know if the guy was some important character or what, but for some reason they seemed to be happy that this guy was apart. And he's talked to them about they need to deal with that. They need to challenge that. And so he gets into a little bit of church discipline concepts. He has talked about idolatry, and he's talked about some things that are going on there, and he's really still kind of in the throes of that right now. But he also talked about how that, listen, the workman is worthy of his hire. And he talked to them about how the Old Testament gives this example of you don't muzzle the ox that's treading out the corn. Now, the one thing we talked about when we covered that was he is saying, listen, as an apostle, I actually do have the right to come in and say, don't muzzle the ox. And, I could say that you guys need to help take care of me. But he doesn't do that. And he actually says, I didn't do that because I thought it would be a hindrance to the gospel. Now, that is an idea that you see often in Paul's writings, and you see it a whole lot in the book of 1 Corinthians on multiple levels. You have to understand, Paul is saying, listen, do not do things that are going to hinder the gospel. You may have the Christian liberty to do so. You may even have the right and authority to claim something. Doesn't always mean you should, right? And that's a pretty common theme. Now, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 specifically, we've already talked about Paul's warning about idolatry. He starts this in a very interesting way, and I'm not going to re-preach all this. I'll just give you a summary of where we're at. He opens up by speaking to them about what happened to Moses and the children of Israel as they came out of Egypt. Listen, these were the called people of God being delivered from Egypt. They saw miracles from God every day, right? I want you to keep that in mind, right? Parting of the Red Sea. Well, that didn't happen every day. No, but they saw it. They experienced it. But they had a pillar of fire. They had a cloud. This thing led them. They had manna come down from heaven. I mean, listen, these people experienced a miracle, and we forget this, They were basically experiencing a miracle every day of their life. And yet what happened to them? Well, when Moses was gone too long, they asked old Aaron to make them an idol that they could worship. And they started giving the things of God credit to that idol. Man, the priest, the guy that like the second in command, fell into that and actually helped participate. We talked about the fact that, and he did quote, by the way, in verse 7 of 1 Corinthians chapter 10, he quoted the Old Testament, how that they sat down to eat and drink and they rose up to play. By the way, he starts this Old Testament example with a thing dealing with the fact that the idol worship, and this is important for the rest of this chapter, his first example deals with the fact that this idol worship involved what? A feast. A big party. They rose up to eat and to drink and to play. That, by the way, for the kids in the room, that they rose up to eat, drink, and to play, that does not mean, well, why is God so upset about that? They were just having a good time. No, that was part of their worship of this idol that they had just built. Okay? You got to keep in mind that that's the first example he gave them when he quoted in this chapter was, hey, listen, what did they do back then? Well, they had Aaron make an idol, and they rose up and they danced and they played and they had a big feast. All part of the worship of this idol. He went on and to talk about, in verse 8, don't let us commit fornication. That, of course, is referring to Numbers chapter 25, verses 1 through 9, where you had more than 23,000 people that were killed because they started committing whoredoms with the people of the land. In verse 9, he's referring to Numbers chapter 24, verses 4 through 9, when he says, neither let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. And we talked about the idea that that's a good picture of Christ, right? How that Moses put that serpent up on the pole. These people were already condemned. They had been bitten. They were dying. And yet the command they were given was, well, just stick your head out of the tent and look at that old brass serpent on that pole and God will heal you. I've often said, they say, how's that a picture of Christ? Well, listen, I've often said that we just take that story for granted. You have been bitten. You are sick. You know you're dying. Everybody else around you that's been bitten by this snake has died. You know you're dying, and yet the advice you give is to just use your last energy to crawl out of the tent and go look at this pole with a serpent on it. Unless you believe God's word, unless you believe the message of God, you're probably not going to do that. Right? So when we talk about look and live, right, it's the idea of, listen, they were already condemned, they were already dying. That's you and me before we were saved. We're already condemned. We're already on our way to hell. We're already guilty. But the message is simple. Man, you got to look to Jesus Christ in belief, and He'll save you. That's really, whenever they would take the time, their dying moments, they would take the time to go outside and to look at this pole. It wasn't about the pole. It was about believing that what God said He would do, He would do. And these are the stories that He's told them. Hey, don't forget what the children of Israel did. The people that saw miracles every day, what did they do? Man, when things didn't go right, they were out there convincing Aaron to make an idol, and they were having a big feast of this thing. Don't forget what they did, man. God told them to stay away from the daughters of the land, and yet, what did they do? Well, they started going in and spending time and marrying and having relations with the children of Moab and the children of Midian. They took the blessings of God, the serpent story. We talked about the fact that they took the blessings of God and they started to murmur and complain about God. And they say that Aaron and God had brought them out of Egypt to just die in the wilderness. They even claimed that they didn't have any food, and yet in the same sentence they said, and we loathe this light bread that we get every day. You know what they were saying? God, you are supplying for us, but we don't want that. God, what you're supplying isn't good enough for us. So we may underestimate those statements. Man, they were literally taking the miracles of God and saying, we don't care about that stuff anymore. Who are these people? These are the children of God. These are the people that have been called out of Egypt, that saw the parting of the Red Sea and saw all these things God did. And yet even them, they murmured, they sinned, they did all these things, right? You say, what are you building up to? Well, he's about to use a statement that we are very familiar with, very popular verse. We don't always understand where that verse came from. You ever heard the idea of be careful? If you think you stand, you might just be ready to fall, right? And I'm not quoting that, I'm just giving you the principle. This chapter contains that verse. At the end of him reminding them, the rulers fell, the everyday people fell, the elders fell. The last verse in verse 10, neither ye murmur, as some of them also murmured and were destroyed of the destroyer. That's referring to, I believe, that's referring to Korah, when his group got swallowed up by the earth because they tried to overthrow Moses and Aaron. Not just that, but what we often forget is the end of that story. The story didn't end there. There was actually a group of people that got upset at God and Moses because the earth swallowed up Korah and his people. And then what happened? Well, God sent a plague, and Aaron had to run out with the incense, and it says that he stood between the people and the wrath. In all those stories, what happens? You got everything from everyday people to the princes and the rulers to even the guy that was going to be the priest falling away. He says those things. And then he says in verse 11, and this is really kind of where we ended up last week. Now all these things happened unto them for ensamples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. He says, listen, all those things, I'm bringing to them, to you, the church at Corinth. I am bringing to them to you, and they are meant to be examples. They're meant to be examples. I wonder how many people sitting in Corinth hearing this letter written were going, yeah, I don't need this. I'm good. Man, I sure hope that guy back 3 rows, I hope he's listening. Right? You ever been there? If you're honest with yourself, you've probably been there too. This is a good message. I hope he's listening. You know what Paul tells them? Paul says in verse 12, wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. He just got done telling them all of these horrible things and these horrible mistakes and sins and transgressions that the children of Israel that had came out of Egypt fell into. And he says, oh, by the way, I'm not just reading this because it's a good Sunday school lesson. You, Church of Corinth, these things were given as examples. Take heed lest you fall. You may be sitting here in this room thinking, I'm good. And Paul is telling you, be careful. Be careful. It is also at that point where we get into another very, very famous verse, verse 13. Therefore hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you're able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it. Wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry. Who is he talking to? Is he talking to the pagans in Corinth? Nope. He's talking to the church at Corinth. And he tells them these stories, and then he says, you need to be careful, because if you think you stand, you may just be about ready to fall. 1. 2. Listen, God is not going to try you and prove you in something where you won't be able to overcome it. And I say this to say, God provides a way for you to make it through those trials, those temptations, those provings. We don't always take it, right? Remember, this verse comes after saying what? Let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. So on one hand, he tells them, man, if you're sitting here all overconfident that you've got this all under control, you need to be careful. And by the way, while we're talking about needing to be careful, you don't sit here and tell me that, well, you've just had a trying, or you've had a temptation, or you've had something that nobody else has had to go through, and yes, you fell into the sin, but it's not your fault because this is just more than you could bear. He says, no. He says, listen, no temptation is taken you but such as common to man. You look at those children of Israel when Moses was up on the mount and they got to thinking he's been gone too long, and they talked Aaron into building them an idol. He said, well, you don't know how it felt to be down there at the bottom of that mountain with all that thunder and lightning and the dark cloud, and Moses has been gone longer. You don't know how I felt at that time. He says, listen, you aren't going through anything that somebody else hasn't experienced in some form or fashion. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you're able, but will with the temptation make a way of escape that you may be able to bear it. The Lord is going to be there, and the Lord is going to provide you a means of escape. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? You know, oftentimes we think about things that happen in our life where we get off track and we aren't what we're supposed to be, and maybe we've fallen into sin, or maybe we're just not doing the things we should do. And you know, we often, I think, tend to kind of, well, it's my situation. I know I shouldn't do it, but man, you don't know the strain I'm under. You don't know the burden I'm under. You don't know the X. You don't know the Y. Those are not excuses that God is going to go, oh, well, in that case, it's fine. Like, I get it. You got off track, but you know what? I get it. You were going through a bad time. It's fine. Don't worry about it. That's actually not what God teaches. God says, I am going to be there with you, and I am going to be your strength, and you need to lean on me, and you need to keep following me. We've covered this in the Psalms, right? So many times, man, poor David was going through some horrible things. And he had doubts, and he had fears, and he had anxiety. But time and time again, what he came to the conclusion of was, man, I gotta keep doing what's right. I gotta keep serving God. I gotta keep trusting the Lord. He knows what he's doing. He's in control. How many times, though, do we go through trials and troubles and issues and things, and we use those things to say, well, that's why I didn't do what I was supposed to. Like I said, I'd encourage you to think about what David found. Man, when things are all bad and things aren't good, you just keep doing what you're supposed to do. You keep serving God. You keep worshiping God. But I'm getting too far off track if I'm not careful here. I want to keep it in context. So, again, he's talked about these sins. He's talked about how they were examples. He's told people, be careful. That if you stand, you be careful because you may be about to fall. He starts to talk about how that there's no temptations taking you but such as common to man. God's faithful. He's not going to suffer you to go through things that you're not able to bear, but He will provide a way of escape. I think even in that statement you have to realize that the ability to make it through those temptations, the ability to make it through those trials, even that is not in your own strength. It's that you have to realize God is going to make a way for you, okay? But then he says in verse 14, wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry. I think it's important to keep in mind the context of all of this stuff. He is dealing with them on some things about idolatry. It's actually not just started here in chapter 10. He's made some references earlier to this. They live in a very, very pagan city. If you've ever studied the history of Corinth, They were another city that was very famous for the temples that they had. And they had temples, listen, from the history and the archaeology that I've looked at, they had temples to the god Apollos. They had temples to Aphrodite. They had temples to... it's just a long list of things that they had temples to. Matter of fact, there's one place just outside the city where if I read this article right, there were like, I want to say, I don't have it in my notes, but it's like 12 to 15 different temples of some kind to some god. These were a people that were surrounded by pagan worship. And if we study the history of Corinth, we also understand that many of them were saved out of that. So we're not just talking about Jewish people who had been born and raised with the idea of one God, the true God, right? And they'd never been to those temples. They'd never taken part in any of that worship. You understand, this is a church that's gotten both Gentiles and Jewish people in it. Many of the people that we're probably talking about would have actually taken part in some of those worship services in earlier stages of their life. I would go so far as to say probably many of them had family members that were still participating in that stuff, right? And he's coming to them saying, be careful, be careful. Don't forget, these people that experienced God's blessings every day, even they came to the place where they murmured. Even they came to the place where they turned from God. Even they did these things. Be careful. Be careful. Flee from idolatry. In verse 15 he says, I speak as to wise men. Judge ye what I say. Now, I don't know whether Paul was being sarcastic in that verse or whether or not he was being serious. He says, I speak as to wise men. He didn't say I speak to wise men. He says I speak as to wise men. Judge ye what I say. He says I'm going to tell you something and I want you to take what I'm going to say and I want you to analyze it. And I want you to come away with some thoughts and some judgments of this. Like, listen to what I'm going to say. I want you to judge this and see if it's accurate. In verse 16 he says, the cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we being many are one bread and one body, for we are all partakers of that one bread. Behold, Israel after the flesh, are not they which eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? Now I'm going to stop reading there. And I don't want to downplay this, but listen, sometimes we can jump into 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and we can ignore everything else and we can talk about verse 16 and 17 and we can start to talk about the Lord's Supper or the one body and the one bread and things like that. You need to ask yourself, why is he even talking about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 10? He's not suddenly changed topics. He is talking to them about fleeing idolatry. And he's about to talk to them about whether or not it's okay to eat the meat that was offered to idols. Okay? In the middle of that, he actually gives them two examples. And I think what he's doing here, he's not necessarily, I don't know that this is some deep teaching about the cup and the bread. He's reminding them that, hey, listen, if you are sitting over here going, oh, it's just a feast, I get it, it's a feast to Aphrodite, but it's just a feast. He dials them back a little bit and he says, okay, when we come together and we partake of the cup and we partake of the bread, isn't there something special about that? Like literally, guys, we're coming together and we're coming together in a remembrance of the Lord, and there's something special about the way that we partake of the cup and the bread. And it's a reminder of what Christ has done for us. And it is a communion, a fellowshipping together. He's also, by the way, telling them that, don't you think that that is part of our worship? Like, when we come together with the communion of the cup and the bread, and we think about what Christ has done and how he shed his blood and he had his body broken for us, when we do that, don't you think that that's worship? Point one. Point two. He says, behold, Israel after the flesh, are not they which eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? If you understand the way that in Judaism, the way that the priests would they would do the sacrifices, they would kill the animals, they would offer them on the altar. Well, part of the whole ceremonial piece of that was not only did they offer them on the altar, but there was part of that they were then were supposed to recognize as being God's provision for the priests. And they would partake of that. And they had to partake of certain pieces of it and certain times and in a certain way. Listen, if you go back and read that and don't come away with the idea that that's part of the ceremonial process, you're missing something, because it was very specific. Like, okay, you got to cook it this way and at this time, and you're going to take part of this piece, and then there's the showbread, and you do a certain thing with that, and there's a timing component of when you do that and how you do that. Paul is saying, hey, listen, don't you think when you look back to what the Jews did, and you look at this and the way that the Lord laid out the sacrifice, don't you think that the priests and their family and the way that they took part of that is not part of the whole altar experience? And then based on saying that, he says in verse 19, what say I then? That the idol is anything, or that which is offered in sacrifice to idols is anything? Hey, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that that idol has some power. I'm not saying that the meat offered to that idol has some power. But I do want you to recognize that before you can just simply brush it off and say, well, it's just a feast. Who cares if it was part of the worship service for an idol? He says, no, listen, man, when we take part in the Lord's Supper and the communion that goes with that, there's something special about that. That's a part of worship. When the priests took part and they did it the way they were supposed to and they followed the way the Lord laid it out, listen, they were taking part in the altar. Man, there was part of that service. In verse 20, but I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils and not to God, and I would not that ye should have fellowship with devils. He says, listen, whatever I'm about to say in the rest of this chapter, I want it really clear to you that when people go over to that temple and they take part in that big feast for Aphrodite, they are doing that to devils and not to God, and I don't want you to have anything to do with that. Now, before you get too far ahead and say, well, wait a second, doesn't Paul teach that it's okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols? Okay, we'll get there. We'll get there. But he's drawing out a point to them, and I think part of that point is don't downplay the significance of some of these feasts that these people around you are having. Don't play the card of, well, it's just a feast. There's no religious aspect to it whatsoever. He says that's not necessarily true. And whatever you do and however you do it, make sure that you as a Christian are not taking part in any kind of worship to an idol. Right? I don't want you to have fellowship with devils. That's what they're doing. They are worshiping devils. I don't want you to have any part of that. He says in verse 21, let me be really specific. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. He says, listen, if you want to put it down into everyday practical life here, he's saying, listen, you can't come into this church and partake of the Lord's Supper and the remembrance of Christ and what He's done for you, and then go partake of the cup of devils. Are you going to worship them or are you going to worship God? You can't live in both worlds. And you say, well, I don't know that that's what he's saying. You're talking about idol worship. What do you think Paul is talking about? He just gave them these examples which involved, a couple of them involved idol worship. He tells them to flee idolatry. He tells them to be careful lest they think they stand. And then now he's talking about that those sacrifices that they sacrifice are to devils, and you can't partake in both. Now, you can take this a couple ways. You can talk about the cup of the Lord's Supper, and I think that's applicable. You could also just talk about the fact that, listen, you can't claim to be Christ's and at the same time dabble in all of this other stuff. It's one or the other, right? You can't dabble in both. But he does say in verse 21, "You cannot be partakers of the Lord's table and of the table of devils. Do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than He?" He says, listen, and keep in mind, he's already told them like 4 or 5 examples of where the children of Israel that came out of Egypt, that saw miracles of God every day, fell into idolatry and murmuring and complaining and following after the things of the land versus the things of God. And in those contexts, he's now saying, listen, you can't serve God and devils. You can't have this close communion with Christ and still be dabbling over here in this stuff that's satanic. You can't do both. Do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Now, that's an interesting statement when you think about those 4 or 5 examples that he gave earlier in the chapter, because the Lord himself in the Old Testament talks about the relationship that he had with the nation of Israel, and that when they went after other gods, man, he was jealous of them. And what usually happened when they did that? Judgment came, chastisement came. And he says, you better be careful. You better not be playing with this stuff. Are you going to provoke the Lord to jealousy? In verse 23, he says, all things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but all things edify not. He says, listen, I've just told you that you can't partake of the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. You can't sit at the table of the Lord and sit at the table of devils. I've told you, be careful that you're not provoking the Lord to jealousy. And then he says, listen, I get it. You can sit here and say, well, I've been bought and paid for. The Lord has redeemed me. I am free from the law. Oh, happy condition. He says, but, listen, not everything that I have the right to do or the ability to do is actually expedient for me. Could I go drink of the wine and eat of the meat at one of these festivals? Probably could. But it's not good for me. And by the way, it also doesn't edify. And edify is like this idea of lifting up or teaching, right? And so he's saying, listen, there's some things I could probably do, but it's not good for those people around me. Others are going to suffer because of me doing this, because they don't understand, because they're confused, because they don't know some of the things that I know yet. And so he says at the end of this whole thing about, you know, you can't drink of the cup of the Lord, you can't drink of the cup of the devils, you don't provoke the Lord to jealousy. Hey, listen, man, there's some things I could probably do, they're not actually for my best. And there's some things I could do that are not good for those people around me. And he's going to further expand that. He says, let no man seek his own, but every man another's wealth. He says, listen, I'll paraphrase it this way. Don't be out there just saying, it's all about me, me, me. When you do things, you make decisions, you need to be thinking about the impact that it has on those around you. Me and Brother Doug were talking before the service today, and listen, in this world, I'm going to use the word Christianity, like in air quotes here, right? It is amazingly common today, like it is a prevailing thought. Hey, stop trying to tell me what I should and shouldn't do. Stop trying to say it's not good to do this. I got my Christian liberty and I can go do what I want. Everybody else needs to mind their own business. there is a loss of care about the impact that that has on other people around us. And by the way, I'm not going to get into it, but I want you to take that thought and you find out biblically where that leads. You say, well, the only challenge is I'm saying other people need to mind their own business and stay out of mine. I'm going to go do what I'm going to do. When you stop caring about the brothers and sisters in Christ around you, there's actually a little bit more that goes with that. And I'm not going to get into it today, but you think about biblically what it means when you have no care for the brothers and sisters in Christ around you. There's a problem there. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Now, you might think that, like, as he said, this whole cup of the devils and table of the devils thing, you might come away from that thinking that, okay, Paul is saying you can't ever drink anything and you can't ever eat anything that's been offered to idols. Well, he's about to go in and he's going to give you some more explanation. He says this, whatsoever is sold in the shambles, that eat, asking no question for conscience sake. Now, we don't really know what that word shambles is. I mean, that's not a word. We use it, but we don't use it the way it's used here. This is not quite right either, but if you've ever been to a farmer's market, right? Think about that. You got your little booths set up at the farmer's market. Somebody's selling corn and somebody's selling something else, and you got the guy over here selling the honey and everything, right? Well, he's basically saying, hey, if you go to the market and you go to the booth and you buy this grain or this meat, you don't have to ask them, oh, hey, by the way, was this wheat and was this piece of meat, was this in any part of worship service for any of these temples around town? Oh, well, I don't know. I'll have to go check my inventory list and see. I get some from this place. Oh, yeah, sorry, that grain right there, that came from the temple of Aphrodite. Oh, yeah, sorry. Can you get some other wheat somewhere I can buy? He's saying you don't have to go to town and say, where did this piece of meat come from? Where did this barley come from? Where did this wheat from? He says, listen, you go to town, you buy the food you need, you go home, you make it, you eat it. Like, that's fine. He says, whatever's sold in the shambles, eat it, asking no questions for conscience sake. Don't worry about it. If you go to town, you go to the market, buy that food, take it and eat it. Why? Well, he says in verse 26, and he quotes here from the Old Testament, for the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Hey, listen, that barley, that wheat, that side of pork, well, maybe Paul wouldn't make pork. I don't know. I guess he did. Later, I don't know. He says, listen, man, those things, God is the provider of all this stuff. Go to town, buy what you need to buy, and eat it, because God provided it. He's quoting, by the way, Psalms chapter 24, verse 1, if you want to turn over there. Psalms chapter 24, verse 1. A psalm of David. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein. He hath founded it upon the seas, established it upon the floods. Who shall ascend unto the hill of the Lord? Who shall stand in his holy place? He that hath clean hands and a pure heart, who hath not lifted up his soul unto vanity, nor sworn deceitfully. He shall receive the blessing from the Lord, and the righteous from the God of his salvation. This is the generation of them that seek him, that seek thy face, O Jacob. Lift up your heads, O ye gates, and be ye lift up, ye everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, O ye gates, even lift them up, ye everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord of hosts. He is the King of glory. Now there's a few things I want you to think about this chapter. He starts with this quote, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Right? He says, hey, listen, go to town, buy your grain, buy your meat, go home, cook it, eat it. You don't have to worry about it because God created it all anyways. God is the creator of all of the things that are in this world are his. In Psalms, when you read the whole chapter, it goes a little further and it talks about the whole world and all they that dwell therein. And then it says, he founded it upon the seas, and he established it upon the floods. Man, the Lord that we serve is the creator of all things. This earth exists because he spoke it into existence. The other thing that I think you see in Psalms chapter 24 is, I love how this chapter ends, right? It repeats itself quite a bit, but it talks about, lift up your heads, O ye gates, and be lifted up, ye everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. He is echoing back to a chapter, when he quotes that verse, he's echoing back to a chapter that declares God created it all, and God deserves all glory and all honor, and he is the only God. That's the chapter that he echoes back to in that simple statement where he talks about the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. I've talked about this often here when we've been going through this. Listen, sometimes the author may only quote one verse or part of a verse. But oftentimes when you read the full chapter, it just makes what he said stand out even more in the context. We're talking about a town full of idol worship on every corner, and Paul warning them not to fall into that, not to be associated with it. And he echoes back to them, listen, when you go to town, don't worry about where your meat comes from. It came from God. But even in quoting that, he's saying, don't forget who God is. God is the creator. God is the only Lord. He's Jehovah. He's the great I am. And he will be victorious. Right? Man, those last couple of verses of Psalm chapter 24 really drive home, man. When the Lord of glory comes in, man, he is strong and mighty. None can overthrow him. Now in verse 27, he goes on and he says, now if any of them that believe not bid you to a feast, and ye be disposed to go. He, by the way, doesn't say you have to go because they invite you. He says, if they invite you and you be disposed to go, whatsoever is set before you, eat, asking no questions for conscience sake. This would be like, let's say that you had been born and raised a pagan, worshiping idols. The Lord saves you, you come out of that, and Friday night, your family that's still involved in all of that stuff invites you over for supper. Hey, we're having a big family get-together. All the family's coming. We got some friends coming. We'd love for you to come. And if you go, you know what? When you get there, sit down and eat whatever they put in front of you. You know what? If they put some grain out there, and they put some bread out there, and they put some food out on the table, a little bit of meat, man, just eat it. You don't have to ask. Before you take that bite, you don't have to go, oh, wait, was this porridge... Was this porridge set at the feet of Aphrodite and some prayer said over it? He said, you don't have to ask. Just go eat it. Now he does clarify, though. He says, but if any man say unto you, this is offered a sacrifice unto idols, and eat not for his sake that showed it, and for conscience sake, for the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. He actually, again, quotes that same verse when he's telling them, oh, by the way, in this scenario, don't eat it. Well, what's the difference? Well, the difference is you got somebody comes up, you're sitting at this table, and you might say, well, this is rude. We don't want to be rude, but listen, there are times where we can't partake in something, right? And he says, you're sitting at this table, everything's going good, and suddenly they bring this big platter out, and as they set it in front of you, you almost get this idea of with a proud, boastful statement, hey man, this is the good stuff. This stuff right here, it was part of the worship of Aphrodite. And this is great. He says, listen, if that's what happens, I want you to just push that plate off to the side. I don't want you to partake of that. What's the difference between the first two? Well, in the first one, you're recognizing the fact that, listen, the Lord created all this stuff. This is the Lord's. Nobody told me it was about idol worship. Nobody told me that it was supposed to be offered as part of the ritual sacrifices. I'm just eating it. It's food. And the Lord provided. But in the second case, you're saying, listen, this is being bragged about in front of me, that this is part of the worship of this idol. He's almost saying, listen, you've crossed over a little bit of a line now, and if you're not careful, you're going to start to be a stumbling block to others. For the person that just provided you with this meat, and they've told you almost, again, you get the idea it's given in pride, like lift it up, this is a great thing, this is part of this idol worship. You get the idea almost that we're saying, oh man, for that person's sake, you need to not partake because you need them to understand you don't want anything to do with the worship of devils. You don't want to. You are partaking of the Lord's table and the Lord's cup. You're not partaking of devils. If it's just meat and that's the way it's given, fine. But if it's given as, hey, this is part of our worship service, you need to be able to back up and say, I don't want anything to do with that. Not for your own sake. I almost think he's saying, hey, listen, if you ate that meat, is anything bad going to happen? I know that you're not doing it as part of worship. You're just looking at it as a hunk of meat on the plate. But that may not be the way others see it. Right? That may not be the way others see it. He goes on here and he says, conscience, I say, not thine own, but of the other. Because it's not about you, it's about them. For why is my liberty judged for another man's conscience? For if I by grace be a partaker, why am I spoken of? For that which I give thanks. Whether therefore ye eat or drink, or whatsoever ye do, do all to the glory of God. He's saying, listen, you can boil it down to this. Whatever you do, make sure that you're doing it to the glory and honor of God. If you think that you're going to be in a scenario where it's not going to give honor and glory to God, then don't do it. If you can do it and still bring glory and honor to God, go ahead. But at the heart of it, you make sure that God gets glory. And I think where we have to be careful is, listen, there are times where could we do something and it be okay? Sure. But is somebody around us going to be confused? Is somebody around us going to maybe fall into sin of their own? Or maybe think, well, maybe there's no difference here. We need to be aware of those around us and the situations, that the things that we do, the perceptions that it causes for other people. And listen, if there's something we can do, and I can be happy and content over here doing it, but it's going to cause somebody else to stumble and fall, then man, we need to be careful. And in the end, what is your heart? What's your motive? Are the things you're doing to give glory and honor to God? There have been some things that people have asked me, and I'm not going to talk about what it is, but listen, there's been some things people have asked me sometimes like, hey, can I do this? Is it okay to do this? And sometimes my first question is, why? Why do you want to? Because what I've found sometimes is that people want to do it because they've always been told they can't. And it's not a matter of what, really, when you boil it down, it's not a matter of whether, is it scripturally okay to do it? It's, I want to do it because I've always been told no, and I think I'm going to do it. So ask yourself, why? Okay, can you do it? Maybe that's not the question. Why do you want to do it? What are you trying to achieve? Do you think that by doing that thing, you are going to be able to bring more glory and honor to God? And then also ask yourself, is this going to cause problems for somebody else? Is this going to be a stumbling block? Is it going to be a challenge for them? Am I going to cause somebody else to fall away? And you say, if you have that heart and attitude about things, I think you will find that some decisions are a little easier to make. When you're not always just thinking about me. He says, whether therefore ye eat or drink, or whatsoever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give none offense, neither to the Jews nor to the Gentiles, nor to the church of God, even as I please all men in all things, not seeking mine own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. He says, listen, and whatever you do, make sure you're doing it for the glory and honor of God. Make sure that whatever you do, that you're not being a harm and a stumbling block to those around you. Because in the end, listen, what you don't want to do, you don't want to put yourself in a place where you can't go to people and say, here's the gospel message. Man, our goal should be that we want to be able to tell people about Christ. Don't always be thinking about yourself and your own profit and what's good for you, and I can do this, and I can do this, and I can do this. Man, you be thinking about, hey, is this going to give glory to God? Hey, is this going to hinder me from being able to share the gospel with somebody? And those should be the types of questions that you're asking yourself. Now, I will tell you, and I'm going to end with this because we're already a couple minutes past. You might look at some of this and talk about, well, why is there so much discussion in here about feasts before idols? Because remember, in verse 7, his example, where they rose up to eat and drink, that eating and drinking was part of the worship service. In the middle here, he talks about the cup of Christ and the table of Christ, and not to downplay that what they're doing over there in their temples. In multiple places here, he's talking about whether you eat or you drink and what they set before you. Why so much conversation about eating and drinking in this chapter? As I studied the history of Corinth, I was intrigued to find that in multiple of these temples that they've uncovered, do you know what they found? Dining rooms. Like in one temple, there were like 36 dining rooms that would serve 8 to 10 people. That was actually in the temple. And so they talked about how that they would, part of the actual cult and the worship service of some of these gods was to have the worship service and then to take some of the stuff from the sacrifice and to cook some other stuff. And then they had all these rooms where people could go and dine on the stuff that had been offered to these idols. Literally part of the temple part of the temple worship. And archaeological evidence shows that many of these temples actually had built-in dining rooms where you could have feasts as part of the service. And so when you understand that some of those, by the way, have been dated to the times of when Paul would have been there. And so when you think about some of that, you realize that, man, this is a very real thing. We don't think about it. Like, how many of you have went to Walmart and before you pick up that piece of chicken, that frozen chicken at Walmart, go, I wonder if this was offered to idols? Like, we don't think about that, right? It was a valid question for them to go, oh, hey, we can't eat meat offered to idols. So Paul, when I go to the farmer's market, how far do I have to take that? Like, do I have to find out whether there was any part of this that was part of a worship service? And he's like, no, don't worry about that. Like, just go to town and buy what you need and go eat it. Well, what if I get asked to a feast? Yeah, fine, go partake. But if this starts to turn into, hey, we're all meeting together to continue our worship from the temple where we're really blessed to be able to be eating this food that was offered to this idol, okay, you've crossed a line and you're going to be a stumbling block to somebody. Don't partake of that. These were very real things for them, and we don't think about it too much. I think the principle, though, although me and you don't have to worry about that too much, about whether that meat at Walmart was offered to an idol, the concept of what's being taught here is something that we very much still need to apply. The decisions you're making, are they glorifying and honoring to God? Are they going to be a stumbling block and a trouble for somebody around you? Maybe you'd be fine to do it, but maybe it would cause somebody else to fall. Well, you need to rethink it, and you need to back off, right? So much more we could get into in chapter 10, but I just thought it was interesting here that he uses those Old Testament examples of the children of Israel coming out of Egypt to remind them, you need to be careful because you can fall too. I think to some degree with the context of what he's talking about, you may have had some people that were going off and starting to be involved in some of those feasts, and they maybe were having the attitude of, it's just, I get it, you know, these people are worshiping Aphrodite, but I'm not. Like, it's fine. And Paul's sitting here going, don't forget about the people that went in and gave their sons to the daughters of Moab. And what happened? Hey, don't forget what happened when the children of Israel went to Aaron and said, why don't you make us an idol and we're going to worship it. Like, you be careful over here dabbling in this stuff over here, because about the time you think you're going to be okay, you're going to go a little bit further and a little bit further and a little bit further, and you're going to turn around. Next thing you know, you're partaking in stuff that you had no intentions of partaking in. Be careful. Right? All right. With that, we're going to go ahead and end in a word of prayer. Thankful for your attention today. Hopefully